At Arizona's Petrified Forest National Park, fossilized wood and bone, reminders of a lush tropical world, litter the high desert. In the first of two episodes, a professor escorts us through geology that records four former worlds along the route from Gallup, New Mexico. At a park visitor center, a ranger explains the origin of petrified logs. The episode concludes with a hike through hoodoos and badlands on the Blue Mesa Loop trail. Join Rock On Mother Earth to discover the clues and colorful cliffs that help scientists imagine former worlds. I'm Roadside Geology of Georgia co-author and Walks and Talks guy Bill Witherspoon. Welcome to Rock On Mother Earth. We get the beat of the planet from her landscapes and rocks. Episode 3, Petrified Forest, Part 1, Imagine Former Worlds. To geoscientists, layers of sedimentary rock are gateways into former worlds. An image from my childhood reading comes to mind. Ruth Plumley Thompson wrote The Royal Book of Oz as her first sequel after Oz creator L. Frank Baum died in 1919. In it, the Scarecrow, now an honored resident of Emerald City, sets out to refute the claim that he has no family tree. Locating the bean pole where Dorothy once found him, he is able to slide down it fireman style into the Silver Islands. The islands turn out to be the home of his royal ancestors. The Scarecrow's beanpole could have inspired the Evolator, short for Evolution Elevator, at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History in Albuquerque. Through what looks like an elevator door, you enter a room. The guide in a video takes you down through rock layers. At levels along the way, the video dramatizes events recorded in the rocks. Lights flash and alarms sound as an asteroid closes out the Mesozoic era and its dinosaurs 65 million years ago. It would be a long descent to reach Mesozoic age layers beneath Albuquerque. Younger sediments that we mentioned in episode 2 related to the Rio Grande Rift have buried them more than 5 miles deep. But along Interstate 40 at locations outside the rift, Mesozoic rocks often are at the surface. Driving west from the 80-million-year-old rocks at Gallup, New Mexico, you descend through at least 4 Mesozoic former worlds en route to the 320-million-year-old layers of Petrified Forest National Park. In this first segment of the podcast, let's visit the 4 sequences of rock layers along I-40 that reveal these worlds. They are the Mesa Verde Group, Mancos Shale, and Dakota Sandstone of the Cretaceous period, and the Entrada Sandstone of the Jurassic period. Dr. Andrew Heckert of Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, is our guide. I first met Dr. Heckert years ago through our common interest in geoscience education. He had persuaded Vulcan Materials Company to deliver tons of boulders from several of their quarries to the campus of Appalachian State University in North Carolina, where he teaches. The first QR codes I ever heard of were the ones Andy employed to turn each boulder into a gateway to learning about Earth's past. Until I worked on this podcast, I did not realize that Dr. Heckert is an expert on the vertebrates of the Triassic period at the beginning of the Mesozoic era. His doctoral work at the University of New Mexico focused on the fossil evidence and layers of sediment in Petrified Forest National Park. You will hear Andy and me discussing images that I shared with him as we met remotely. Our first viewpoint into the past was on the north side of I-40 at the edge of Gallup. It's the second cut past milepost 19. West of exit 16, watch for the milepost after a large car graveyard on the right, which hides the community of Allison from view. Allison is the site of former coal mining from the Mesa Verde Group. Please stay safe. A companion should drive when you look at rocks. Remember, it is for your safety that highway patrols discourage stopping along the shoulder. We're going to start by going to this shot here, which is on the outskirts of Gallup. Gallup, New Mexico, I understand part of the reason the railroad chose that location had to do with the fact that there were coal resources nearby. And I think that there's a whole lot of coal in something called the Mesa Verde Group that's named after Mesa Verde, where Mesa Verde National Park is. This picture is an outcrop that you drive by on I-40. And towards the top of it, it looks like there is possibly there's some dark looking material that could be the coal seam that part
Uh,
of what they were mining in the area.
those are seams, and you're absolutely
Mhm.
right. Gallup is there because it was a relatively low spot to punch through on into Arizona, and there was coal, 19th century, maybe even early 20th century coal workings in the immediate vicinity of Gallup. And then there's some monster modern workings just north of there.
So could you tell me what we're looking at and what it takes to make coal deposits that was happening at the time of the Mesa Verde Group?
As a geologist, I'm thinking of modern day Louisiana. I've got some sandy beds that are river deposits. There's some inclined strata. It's a little bit of a sandstone channel, some sand above it, and then there's some more reddish, probably mudstones. So probably floodplain deposits. And then the coals themselves are really forming in swamps or possibly bayou type things. Like I say, we're Louisiana. We're not in the ocean, but we're barely above sea level, probably. And we have immense amounts of vegetation. This is the Cretaceous, so it's very warm, it's very tropical. You have uplands or highlands to the west of you, and those are shedding sediments into our Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway that runs across the center of the continent.
What kind of animals would have found this a good place to live at that time?
The swamps were probably filled with animals that would superficially look similar to you. If you could like time travel back here, you'd see a lot of fish in the water, but they're both in fish, garfish.
Okay, so gar is this kind of long, skinny, pointy thing that I've seen in the Tennessee Aquarium before.
Yes,
That
they have really thick scales. They have an extra layer of ganoine, I think it is. So we find their fossils are like really common and really identifiable because every gar had thousands of scales. You would, especially in those coal beds, you would expect to see things like gars and crocodiles, some of which were enormous. Because there are dinosaur fossils here, but they're not common. But there would have been dinosaurs. There would have been horned dinosaurs, theoretically. There would have been not Tyrannosaurus Rex, but a smaller, earlier Tyrannosaur, hadrosaurs, the duckbills. A pretty typical, by North American standards, Cretaceous dinosaur fauna. Mammals would have been very small, mouse-sized things for the most part.
okay, let's head another 5 miles along I-40 to talk about a different world that preceded the coal swamp. Immediately west of milepost 13, the Mancos Shale is visible in cuts on both sides of the interstate. Before I ask you about the Mancos world, I need to explain the tilt in the layers. These layers tilt westward at about 20 degrees because we are crossing one of the occasional giant wrinkles in the uplifted layers of the Four Corners region. They are mostly the result of the same compressive forces that pressed up the Rocky Mountains beginning late in the Cretaceous period. So we are looking at an image of the rocks north of the road. Tell me something about the Mancos Shale. What's different from the Mesa Verde Group?
It superficially looks kind of similar. You have these muds settling out of effectively still water. And they're dark colored because there's no oxygen there. But this is almost entirely, if not entirely, marine. The more resistant beds, the lighter colored beds, are probably sandstones. In the Cretaceous, there is a lot of localized sea level change. So every ledge here is probably when the Western Interior Seaway is a little bit lower. And so you're kind of more on a beach or in the delta. And then when you're in these darker strata, the sea level is higher, and now you're more offshore. There's a complex interplay of things that determine whether you're kind of in the ocean or more on the shoreline.
What kind of factors are in that interplay?
Is the sea actually rising? Are there reasons why water is being pushed out onto the continents? Or is the land under the sea sinking, or is the sediment coming from the mountains? Is there more tectonic activity and it pushes sediment out? The Mancos is enormous. It covers, I mean, you can go to North Dakota and get into Mancos rocks if you want. I mean, that interval is marine. The sea was very high, and those deposits cover a lot of ground. So there's Mancos in Utah, there's Mancos and all up and down the Rocky Mountains. I've never really gotten out at these outcrops, but the Mancos is very famous for having tons of ammonites, so these relatives of the chambered nautilus that are the kind of the key index fossil or time teller of this interval. Shark's teeth are actually very common in Mancos deposits. There's a wide range of typical Cretaceous marine animals, a lot of clams, a lot of gastropods.
What about the huge marine reptiles that you see in museums?
They
Are they?
they exist. There are definitely mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and things that have come out of these beds in other places. A lot of this area is on the Navajo reservation, and that's a harder ticket to get permits on. But we have a very good representation of the fauna of the Mancos, even if we don't know exactly which animals were here in Greater Gallup.
Let's go 8 miles farther along I-40 to look at a layer below the Mancos, the Dakota sandstone. Our listeners should watch for a bridge at milepost 5. By this point, the Dakota sandstone is visible in hills southeast of I-40 as a brownish red cap over light-colored pink and white sandstone. We are looking at a picture taken about 3/4 of a mile past the bridge, looking at rocks about 1,000 feet from the roadway. Tell us about this darker looking sandstone that caps a whole lot of the topography around here that's called the Dakota sandstone.
Be wondering, why is it called the Dakota sandstone? And it's because rocks of this nature literally crop out across the American West, right? There's an eroded landscape underneath that, and that's this Jurassic landscape. And then these deposits start forming as the beginning of the approach of the Western Interior Seaway, the seaway that's going to divide North America into Appalachia and Laramidia. As that water starts coming up, then the rivers that used to flow across the continent get backed up. And so then they start depositing their sediments at the shoreline. And so you get very, very similar rocks wherever that happens. The challenge is that the bottom of it may not be the same age everywhere. When this happens in like extreme eastern New Mexico, say, you're probably earlier in time than you are in western New Mexico. But it's yeah, it's a big set of river deposits, and it's very well known for its dinosaur tracks all up and down it.
What are we looking at beneath the Dakota here?
These are massive cliffs of sandstone. They're very definitely wind driven. So the sands are very fine, very pure quartz typically, and that's really all there is in the depositional system. Anything finer is simply blown away, and the wind can't move anything coarser grained into it. So you just have part of this gigantic dune field that's really the story of much of the mid to late Jurassic on the Colorado Plateau. During this time, we're at latitudes more or less equivalent to the Sahara. And so that's why we have rocks that broadly look like things that might have been deposited in the Sahara Desert.
You mean the latitude is different for these rocks when they were deposited from the rocks that are younger that we've been looking at?
Yeah, there's a significant amount of time missing on that line that basically separates the what I would call yellowish sandstone from the darker, it's like somewhat greenish sandstone.
These are really just two different former worlds, essentially. We're
Yeah,
talking about a world of a Sahara Desert, and then this area was farther north, so the world seemed very different.
yeah, and I mean it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
mind-boggling to think. I mean, right,
yeah.
right there, it looks like, I mean, if I really wanted to look at those rocks, I'd walk up that slope to the
Mhm.
left. I'd keep my eyes out for rattlesnakes. They love those sandstone boulders. Yeah, they're easy to slide under when it gets hot and then slide back out on top when they need to warm up. But I would walk up that left-hand side, and there's, and you can like literally put half of your hand in the Jurassic and the other half of your hand in the Cretaceous, and not even particularly early in the Cretaceous. I mean, we're talking like tens of millions of years later. So that dune field
So,
eroded down. There may have been other rocks on top of it. We don't
mhm.
know. They're gone. So yeah, we may, there may be a whole nother, of your former worlds not
Yeah.
recorded here. It was probably present, but
Hmm.
just eroded away.
So at our last two spots along I-40, our listeners can get out to stretch their legs. Just across the Arizona state line, they should use exit 389 and park near the Yellow Horse trading post just opposite the exit. We are looking at an image that shows pink and white cliffs of Entrada sandstone beneath a thin cap of brownish Dakota sandstone. This gets spectacular here.
Yeah.
What are we looking at behind this yellow horse trading post?
Oh, massive sand dunes, huge sand sea, Tatooine, right? The the same Tunisian or whatever deserts that they used for Star Wars. Each of those cliffs has got to be 60, 70 feet tall, right? And so you're looking at a couple hundred feet of Entrada for sure there. The same sandstone you can see in eastern New Mexico at Caps Cliffs. This is the
Mm.
same sandstone that the arches at Arches are made out of.
There's some arches developing in this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
why do you get arches in the Entrada or in this particular sandstone?
So a lot of times what happens is that water is moving through these rocks as it gets to some boundary where it percolates out. It has a tendency to break down the cement in those sands. And so then they start getting a little weaker and they crumble away. And then it's a little less stable and more of it crumbles away. And so you're basically just kind of eroding away the landscape from the bottom upwards, and you get these kind of arcuate surfaces. And so like at Arches, the tectonics dealt you a different hand. And so these cliffs tend to be broken into long bands. And so you don't have to go too far before you punch out on the other side. So here
So
you got a bunch of proto arches, but you would have to go like hundreds of feet into the cliff to come out the other side. Now, the interesting thing is that you really can't preserve those massive sand dunes unless the sediments are kind of sinking and there isn't some water available. As much as I've tried to paint a picture of this being like Tatooine, it's actually a little bit wetter of an ecosystem than, or at least there's groundwater
mm,
not too very far away. And the Entrada has a fair number of footprints in it. And these are often of like large predatory dinosaurs. So while it looks just absolutely inhospitable, there was clearly enough of an ecosystem to keep 20, 25-foot long predatory dinosaurs alive. So like you have the lower kind of rounded cliff, and then there's a very prominent line that divides it from the next cliff of similar colors that's like even more sheer. And that's probably an ancient groundwater table. And so that first set of dunes subsided over geologic time. The water table came up through them. Because the water table's holding that sand together, it erodes down to that planar line. And then another massive sheet of sand came in.
there's more to see in the Entrada world in this next image. Listeners need to continue half a mile southwest along the access road past the Arizona Welcome Center to park near the last picnic shelter. We're looking up at the cliffs above it. You see a lot of diagonal lines sloping to the left, and presumably those are part of these sloping sand dune faces,
Yes,
correct?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's some really nice dune formed sandstones in that upper left.
If you look well past this last picnic shelter, set farther back from the road, and up at the top, you see curved surfaces sloping to the left. And that's what we're talking about. Tell me about that.
The upper part of the cliff is a little bit easier to work with because you can see it in more three dimensions, right? Whereas the cliff
Mm.
faces, you only get two. You could just really visualize different dune surfaces, wind as from our perspective, right to left, and you can see multiple dunes sort of stacked on top of each other.
Past the Welcome Center, you merge onto I-40 again. Half a mile further on, a few red rocks are visible on the right, tilted eastward. We are crossing an asymmetric wrinkle in the layers that brings us down to the top of the Triassic Age Chinle Formation. This is the former world expressed in the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest. Near its top, the Chinle records a world that was becoming more arid as this part of North America drifted northward out of the wet tropics. It is about a 40-minute drive to exit 311 and your arrival at the headquarters of Petrified Forest National Park. The park's name is itself an invitation to imagine. Taken literally, you might expect a fairyland of standing trees, swarming insects, and scary reptiles all frozen in stone. Instead, only an occasional bird or lizard moves among scattered cacti. In the park store, watch the introductory film. Outside, you can watch fossil preparation demonstrations through the window of a lab. Then, in the Painted Desert Visitor Center, find the table displaying samples of petrified wood. Ask the ranger on duty to tell you about them. You might meet Ranger Hallie Larsen. Ranger Larsen has worked for the National Park Service for 34 years, the most recent 26 years at Petrified Forest. After undergraduate training in biology and archaeology, she completed a master's degree in interpretation of natural resources. I asked what has sustained her enthusiasm about the park.
The science of this park is really what grabbed me because we continue to add new things to science. It's pretty exciting.
You're standing there next to this piece of petrified wood, and I say, what is that?
This is petrified wood. And petrified wood is actually a fossil that tells us about trees from over 200 million years ago. It was actually in the late Triassic. So we're talking right at the dawn of the dinosaurs. The biggest things that lived here, animal-wise, were actually giant reptiles, not dinosaurs. They probably even ate the dinosaurs. There were no flowering plants at that time. Can you imagine a tropical floodplain with no flowers? To me, that's very bizarre. There were ferns and cycads and conifers and one ginkgo, trees that could get up to 200 feet tall. So imagine this place with huge rivers and these trees that are now reflected as stone fossil trees themselves.
How did it get from being a living tree to being this piece of stone?
Trees, when they would die, if they fell on land, they would just rot away. But the ones that fell into the rivers were riding those waves downstream. They would bounce and scrape until they had no bark, no leaves, no twigs. Every once in a while we might find a branch, and we're excited when we do. But these driftwood would form large log jams. In fact, I often joke with the visitors, this should have been called Petrified Log Jam National Park. It just doesn't sound as nice. And more mud and muck and sand and silt would cover these log jams. This prevented them from just simply rotting. And the logs would soak in all the minerals from the water. But it included an incredibly important ingredient. That was silica. Now, silica people think of as sand, but sand is too big to soak into a tree. We needed something very fine. And way over to the west, there were islands that were chugging out fine volcanic ash. And the ash was brought by the wind to this area, silica going into solution in the water. I suspect that the rivers looked kind of milky. And this would actually go into the tissue of the trees, and the silica crystals would precipitate out on any surface. Those may remember making sugar crystals when we were in elementary school. Same thing there. You had a super saturated bunch of water with sugar, and you put a string with, say, a washer on it, and crystals would actually grow on the string and the washer. You had rock candy all of a sudden. In this case, it was silica, which is very hard in the petrified wood because it grew inside the cell structure. We had it in there in cracks and hollows, and all of those bits are replaced with the silica and iron oxide, manganese oxides, a lot of impurities, which give us the color eventually. Fully agatized petrified wood is called a pseudomorph or a copy because it's kind of like a jello mold. It may look like the Bugs Bunny, but it's just strawberry jello. It may look like a tree, but it's just silica. It actually was a period of when it was opalized, not fully crystallized. It's actually layers with water in between. And we do see the opaline stage here. It is not fully petrified, and in fact, within the layers of silica, there's still Triassic wood. And it makes it more interesting, actually, to the scientists because you can make microslides and actually look at the cell structure.
So you're showing folks examples of both partially and fully petrified wood at the table. Can they see the difference?
People will totally notice the difference between these because those not fully finished, they aren't rainbow colored. They're not kind of glassy and glittery, but they often hide pockets of crystals. So those guys aren't finished, but as it continues to become the rainbow stuff, that's where only the exterior really reveals what the trees look like. And those are the ones, of course, we're known for the rainbow wood.
But you're saying that some of the logs are suspended, they've got some opal, and they've actually still got some, when you say wood, wood in what form?
Lignum, it is organic still, but fully sealed in the silica.
There's always this Jurassic Park fantasy of pulling out DNA and cloning something. DNA is all gone, right? How's that? It doesn't work here either.
I would totally grow one of those myself if I could. Our second most common question here is who cut the logs? So as erosion revealed these, and as they were pushed up, there was a lot of stress on these and they snapped in place. The logs would come out, and if water went between the cracks, it would ice wedge them up or off the log, and gravity would help pull them down. It was nature doing a much nicer job than humans tend to.
From park headquarters at the north entrance, visitors typically make the 26-mile drive to the Rainbow Forest Museum and its Giant Logs Trail near the south entrance. On the way, we will explore the 1-mile Blue Mesa Loop trail near the center of the park. I asked Dr. Heckert to help us understand both today's landscape and the former world of the Chinle Formation as we examine photos that I captured along the loop. You start out the trail from the trailhead, and the first thing I noticed was to the right, some of the most human-looking hoodoos that I've ever seen. So there are two of them to the right that look like twins, and then right next to there is one with a nose, right in the right place. So I imagine people would want to know a little bit about what makes hoodoos.
This region, because it's so relatively arid, and really in some ways the park is like these last little erosional remnants, these badlands stretching out from these sort of hard-capped hills. So there's just really spectacular hoodoos and other things like that. As a geologist reading the rocks, as you would say, I can't get up to that thing with a hand lens. I can tell that it's resistant overall, right? That it's capping this cliff. It's relatively slow to erode. These are mostly big conglomerates and sandstones. These are ancient river deposits and a fairly fast-moving, relatively large river. I mean, this is a pretty major river system coming through at this time. And the difference between fluvial or river sediment and sedimentary rock is that those sand grains and pebbles and everything have to go from being loose sediment to somehow cemented together. So usually that cement occurs after the rock has been buried somewhat, and many different minerals might actually become the cement. And then some of these sandstones do have layers where there's maybe more mud in them, and those layers erode a little faster, and other layers where maybe there was a little bit more silica or the cement was a little bit stronger, and so those layers weather a little bit more slowly.
Since I hear that petrified wood weathers very slowly, I wondered whether that nose could be petrified wood.
That could well be a petrified log. The petrified logs at Petrified Forest almost entirely come out of these big fluvial deposits. These are streams that are capable of floating those giant tree trunks back in the Triassic.
Continuing on the trail, there's a switchback around some purple rock with a lot of gravel in it, which I want to ask you about later. Below the switchback, there's a gray mud rock with a texture that reminds me of an elephant's skin. I know we discussed shale, which is thinly layered mud rock, in the outcrops near Gallup, but this doesn't look layered. What is this weird textured surface?
I would call that popcorn weathering. So these again are floodplains, They're basically mud. So when that river system jumps its banks, it deposits maybe a little sand very close to the river, but then when you get out away from the channel itself, it just is depositing lots and lots of mud. And this mud in particular, we know that there's a lot of volcanoes going off south of here, and there's also volcanoes offshore to the west. And as a consequence, not only are we getting the mud from the river, but we are getting a component of volcanic ash. These clays expand when they get wet. So that's why it's such an irregular looking thing. If somebody's used to seeing shaly outcrops, they're more used to just seeing like very fine grained layers. But with these rocks, the outer foot or two shrinks and swells whenever it gets wet. And so you get this very irregular, we call it popcorn weathering surface.
Right. So I'm remembering that weathered volcanic ash produces a lot of a particular clay mineral called montmorillonite. I think that clay is supposed to swell up to like 5 times its size when wet. Does that make it harder for plants to grow? A desert plant would have gotten established here if it hadn't been for all that volcanic ash.
Yeah, the plants don't like these things so much. And if you're out wandering around on this stuff, you keep an eye on the sky because if it's like July and August and you're likely to get a late afternoon thunder shower, this stuff is absolutely no fun to be on when it's wet because it's simultaneously slick and sticky. It's just bizarre. So it's like you're walking around and your boots just become these sodden masses where you have like 10-pound discs of clay on each boot. It's also like very slick, outside the park where you can be driving on this stuff. If it gets wet, it's just a nightmare.
Wow, I see why they paved this trail. So after the trail reaches the bottom of the slope, it loops around a big flat area. I'm showing you a shot of a petrified log I saw out in the middle of the flat area. I heard you say the logs come mostly from that layer we discussed with the hoodoos way up the hill around the trailhead. So that's one of these logs, right? How did it get down here?
Absolutely, that's a petrified log that I would strongly suspect has been what I would call let down. That thing may have eroded out of a feature that was there 10,000 years ago. Those things are really hard. They're basically quartz, so they have a physical hardness of 7. They're chemically very, very difficult to attack. As the rocks erode out underneath them, they just kind of keep sinking down.
Wow. So we head around the loop and double back. We're looking at a sort of a cliff, maybe 25 feet high. The place is easy to recognize because at the top is a railing and a sign. I figured out that it's an overlook at the road's first turnout after the trailhead. I'm thinking you can make a story out of the sedimentary layers in the cliff from bottom to top based on the colors and textures in the photo.
I actually think, looking at this site, I think I remember my advisor having his hat blow off up there and down into one of the little rills, and we had to go chase it. We're looking obviously at many different layers, some of which are fairly obvious, different colors, and some of them are, to a geologist at least, fairly obviously different rocks, at least if you've been out there. It's a river system, so by human standards, it seems like it's sort of a static thing. But over geologic time, sometimes you're in the river, sometimes it's meandered away and you're in the floodplain. Most of those darker layers are soils that are developed in the floodplains. So, down in that lower left-hand side, there's a darkish purplish band that I would suspect is a mudstone. I would expect that that is probably a floodplain deposit. And that next white layer has indications of some complicated bedding. I think that's a river channel deposit. Almost certainly it transitions back into a purplish mud, and then there's some more light colored sediment that I suspect is you're close to that river channel again, and you're getting sands and maybe even a little bit of gravel. One of the other things about the sands out here is that a lot of times they've cannibalized old floodplains. So you'll see in these sands, you'll see chips of the purple mudstones and things like that from when they got out of their banks and tore across part of the floodplain and ripped up some of the sediment. And that gets us up to another purplish band that's got a little bit lighter band in between. And that's probably floodplain deposits with maybe a little bit of channel stuff. These darker sediments, we pretty much all agree now, are all what we would call poorly drained. So this is a very wet floodplain. Get up through a little bit more light purplish stuff to another river channel, and then we're back into probably a floodplain. And you see there's little white spots up there. Those are almost surely roots all along that horizon. And when you get up close to them, sometimes you see that they're a little bit lighter green, that there's some reduced oxygen pore sediment there, perhaps from roots decaying. Then back into what to me I would describe as a sort of almost pinkish set of beds that then go kind of white, and that's very definitely river deposits, fluvial deposits. And then we go on up. It's a very complicated story. There's multiple different channels sort of stacked on top of each other. You can see how the lighter colored sediment cuts out the somewhat darker lower sediment, and then that lighter sediment is itself cut out by yet another stack of sediment. Then we get up to the top, and I think we're back in a floodplain until we get like right up to the sign there. And it looks like there's a little sandstone bench. In this landscape, it's almost impossible for that bench not to be a sandstone or a conglomerate. So a main channel deposit that's probably pretty well cemented, more so than the other rocks in the section.
So this was 25 feet out of maybe 300 vertical feet of Chinle Formation exposed in the park. A ranger told me there are 20 million years of Earth history represented in those 300 feet of sediment. If you had to guess, how much time would be represented in the sediment you just talked us through?
I feel like there's potential for a total of tens to hundreds of thousands of years in this hill slope, maybe even as much as a million, but it's very difficult to really tie it down. Another thing that's kind of fun to think about is that like these thinner, dark muds are probably what some geologists call time rich. There's probably a lot more time there than there is in these lighter colored sediments, because those lighter colored fluvial sediments are deposited fairly quickly when a stream comes through and builds up its channel or whatnot. Whereas those floodplain muds, those may have been deposited incrementally with floods every 10, 50, 100 years or whatever.
We climb back out, and just above a switchback, almost up to where we started, here is this reddish purple rock full of bumps. So I finish out our walk on the Blue Mesa Trail asking you, what are we seeing?
Those bumps are all stream pebbles. So you're basically looking at the riverbed, and this is probably in fairly mountainous country, or like just outside of the mountains where the river is still moving quite quickly because it's able to move all of this. Interestingly to me, as a Triassic person, these deposits are bad for vertebrate fossils. There's so many rocks, there's so much material moving around in here that tends to pulverize Triassic animals. But say if you were to go to Dinosaur National Monument, the big dinosaur quarry at Dinosaur National Monument is in a rock very similar to this. It's just that those dinosaurs are so gigantic that their bodies, their bones were able to handle that kind of current and weren't as beat up. So, I don't look in these for fossils, but if I were in the Jurassic, I'd absolutely look in them for fossils, because when the fossils are like the size of tree trunks, they actually handle it quite well.
How interesting. And the tree trunks are here too.
Yes.
The tree trunks didn't make it through some of this stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, in most of the tree trunks of petrified forest, there is no bark on them. So they look amazing and pristine, and they're gorgeous, of course, with all the fun replacement of the wood with various silica and metal oxides. But they actually have had the bark stripped off of them by and large. Those trunks have been somewhat abused by the river system.
In our remaining episode at Petrified Forest, a ranger paleontologist at the Rainbow Museum guides visitors assembling a fossil skull. We immerse ourselves in a diorama, then hike to the park's most famous giant log. We finish by asking why so many of the park's fossil animal groups eventually lost out to the dinosaurs. Thanks to the National Park Service staff, including Chief of Interpretation Sarah Herve and Hallie Larsen. Thanks to Dr. Andrew Heckert of Appalachian State University. I'm Bill Witherspoon. Remember to get the beat of the planet from her landscapes and rocks. Thanks for listening to Rock On Mother Earth.
Get the beat of the planet from her landscapes and rocks. So rock on.